Good morning. What are the prospects for a new president achieving a fair peace settlement between Israelis and Palestinians? I believe, unfortunately, that they are not very good. But by a fair settlement, I mean a two-state solution, a Palestinian state comprising Gaza and the West Bank with some minor negotiated land swaps, with control of its borders, its water resources, its airspace, something similar to the Clinton parameters of 2000. I believe that this outcome, more than any alternative, would satisfy the core needs for security and self-determination of both Israelis and Palestinians. As you know, every American president since Lyndon Johnson has tried to stop Israel from building settlements on the West Bank because they understood that those settlements threatened to foreclose the possibility of a two-state solution. Some presidents pushed hard, some not very hard. At Camp David, Jimmy Carter believed he had received from Menachem Begin assurances that settlement building would stop and that a process leading to Palestinian self-determination and autonomy on the West Bank would commence. But settlement building did not stop, and both Carter and the Egyptians, for different reasons, did not make too much of a fuss. Ronald Reagan called for a settlement freeze without making a big issue of it. George H.W. Bush did make a big issue of it and paid a steep political price, which may have cost him re-election. Bill Clinton wanted very much a viable Palestinian state, and he found that settlement building continued whether Israel was headed by Likud or by Labor, and indeed accelerated throughout the 1990s. Barack Obama made a settlement freeze the jumping off point for his peace efforts and was smacked down decisively by Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israel lobby. The reason for these failures is obvious. Israel, no matter what coalition was in charge, wanted to build settlements on the West Bank more than the United States was committed to stopping them. The Israel lobby, which I would describe as a loose coalition of groups and individuals who are committed to ensuring American backing for Israel, no matter what Israel does, was able to generate enough political pressure to thwart serious American diplomacy to stop settlement building. Nevertheless, something important is beginning to happen. The Israel lobby is beginning to exhibit cracks and weaknesses. I believe we are witnessing the beginnings of an historic transformation in which its power will be considerably diminished. First, the Democratic Party. On the second night of the convention, roughly half the delegates in the hall, perhaps a quarter of the 6,000, voted no to what party leaders had assumed was a routine platform resolution amendment stating that Jerusalem was Israel's undivided capital. Such planks had appeared in both party platforms before, and in practice, presidents had ignored them, so not much of substance was at stake. But in the spirit, in the emotion, which is at the root of political change, a great deal happened. I'm sure many of you have seen the video. 3 votes, 3 choruses of no, as unplanned as they were unexpected. Big party poobahs descended on the television booths to play down the episode. Alan Dershowitz described the naysayers as rogue elements, Arab Americans and anti-Zionist Jews. 1,500 of them, apparently. What took place, I would call nothing less than a collective Rosa Parks moment. Let me quote one reaction from Alana Goodman of Commentary magazine, which is now unabashedly a Republican publication. This video, she wrote, this video of the voice vote should chill every pro-Israel Democrat, scratch that, every pro-Israel American to the bone. Israel relies on bipartisan political support from the United States, its strongest ally. The floor vote at the Democratic Convention portends a day when that bipartisan support will cease to exist. As Tom said, I'm a former neoconservative and in another life used to write frequently for Commentary. I think Alana Goodman is completely correct that the contested vote does indeed portend such a day. How far in the future, I don't know. It was a decade between Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus and the emergency of a sufficiently powerful anti-segregation consensus to pass civil rights legislation. For a major political party to become devoted to fairness between Israel and Palestine will take at least that long. But the reason that Alan Dershowitz and commentary find the erosion of bipartisan support alarming is that partisanship would let loose a torrent of competitive debate about the morality and the utility of America's special relationship with Israel. Israel's treatment of the Palestinians under the occupation would be subject not only to academic and journalistic scrutiny, as it is now, but to political polemics. Something like the openly expressed skepticism about Israel's behavior now heard on elite university campuses would become widely disseminated. The special relationship's survival depends on its own rules of discourse. Israel's value to the United States is held to be so self-evident, its interests and values so obviously congruent to America's, that any criticism must be deemed marginal, weird, motivated by bigotry. Those who question the consensus are not debated and often smeared. But once the seal is broken, I believe, and I think Alana Goodman believes, the notion that it is some sort of metaphysical requirement to treat Israel as a privileged and adored touchstone of American Mideast policy could unravel with stunning speed. Other signs are pointing in the same direction. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions resolutions were voted upon in the National Methodist and Presbyterian conventions this summer. Neither passed, but the Presbyterian resolution fell short by 2 votes out of more than 600. More recently, leaders of several mainline churches made a formal request to Congress to investigate Israeli human rights violations to determine if Israel is violating the terms of use of the American weapons it receives. For a long time, Protestant churches have been inhibited on these questions. Their leaders instinctively gravitate towards warm ecumenical relations with mainstream Jewish organizations, with whom the mainline churches have built historic alliances on civil rights, on Vietnam, and on church-state relations. And yet these churches also have ties to the Arab world as educators and missionaries and social workers in refugee camps, and they have Arab co-religionists. They see themselves as promoters of social justice. Historically, this tension has always been resolved in favor of silence, so as not to upset relations with America's Jewish leaders. That period, which has lasted since the founding of Israel, seems to be now over. Thirdly, the very obvious pushback against Israel's effort to persuade the United States to attack Iran or to support an Israeli strike or to accept Israeli advice over what timetables or red lines Washington should adopt. This has involved some firm public language, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs saying, "We don't want to be complicit in an Israeli attack," Secretary of State Clinton explicitly rejecting Israel's red lines, Obama not rearranging his schedule to meet with Netanyahu in New York. Of course, this wasn't over Palestine. It was over an issue with more immediate and obvious economic and security implications for the United States. But it was also the most unmistakable public defiance of Israel's wishes by an American president in a very long time. And though I'm assuming that the election is now a toss-up, the events I referred to were followed by Obama's largest lead in the polls this year. And if Obama loses, I think we can say with assurance that a public disagreement with Prime Minister Netanyahu had nothing to do with it. I could point to other areas, but you get the idea. Discussion of Israel-Palestine is opening up in historic ways. The Congress is a lagging indicator, still rolling out AIPAC-sponsored resolutions by the margins everyone is familiar with. But one day, the glasnost will penetrate up here as well. What relevance does this have for the next president? Unfortunately, I fear not very much. I won't say much about Mitt Romney. I would love to be proven wrong, but on the basis of his public statements, his private comments which have become public, and his choice of foreign policy advisors, I believe there's no chance he will become engaged in restarting a genuine peace process. Obama is a different matter. He clearly wants a Palestinian state. He was decisively rebuked in the first year and a half of his administration. He couldn't persuade Israel to carry out a settlement freeze, much less withdraw from territory. Could next year be different? I've fallen into the camp of those who now think the time for a two-state solution has probably passed. I believe Israeli settlements on the West Bank have precluded the possibility. There are too many settlers, armed and intensely committed to remain there. It is not clear that any Israeli government could remove them without risking a civil war. And though there are mild Israeli polling majorities in favor of a two-state solution, there's no significant Israeli constituency for giving up any sovereignty over East Jerusalem, and a Palestinian state without Jerusalem as a capital is a non-starter. There is now one state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, a state connected by a highly developed infrastructure of roads and water pipelines. I'm not sure when the point of return was passed. 7 years ago on my first visit to Israel, it still seemed quite plausible to speak of a Palestinian state. Now it does not. So I believe any kind of normal diplomatic process, appointment of a special envoy, searching for common ground, building on previous agreements, such as those arrived at under Prime Minister Olmert and Prime Minister Barak, don't have much chance of success. There's no political majority in Israel in favor of withdrawing from the territory and settlements Israel would have to do to allow a genuinely economically viable Palestinian state. Prime Minister Netanyahu, I know, has given lip service to the idea, but people close to him have said he would never offer the Palestinians something he could accept. An archipelago of Bantustans on the West Bank, areas A and B, cut off from the world, without control of their airspace, their water, will not produce a viable state. So what can the next president do to change this? The only intervention which might shake Israel out of its current spiral would be if a president made clear where the United States sees this heading. Absent a two-state solution, Israel is en route to becoming an apartheid state. Israelis will not willingly accept granting Palestinians voting or civil rights. So we're headed towards a state roughly half Palestinian, half Jewish, one group denied political and civil rights, the other group possessing them. Could President Obama cite words that previous Israeli prime ministers have warned quite unambiguously that Israel would be facing an apartheid situation in the absence of a two-state solution? Could Obama tell the Israelis that regardless of who is president, it will be very difficult for America to maintain a special relationship with an apartheid state in the middle of the Middle East, that such an alliance would contravene America's values and interests, and that once the relevant question in the one state that exists between the river and the sea is whether Palestinians should have equal voting rights as Jews, it will be natural, given America's democratic ideology and its history, that it will support Palestinian voting rights. Failure to do so would not make sense to most Americans, and in a practical sense would render it impossible for the United States to speak credibly in favor of democracy or human rights in the Middle East or anywhere else in the world. In other words, the centerpiece of the president's intervention would be shifted from the Palestinians and their historic suffering and their need for self-determination. I'm pretty sure most Israelis don't care very much about that. It would be about American values and American interests and where Israel fits into them. I'm not sure that such a speech, perhaps accompanied by diplomatic measures such as not using America's UN veto on Israel's behalf, or perhaps even supporting pro-Palestinian measures, would change the political calculus in Israel. Perhaps it would not have impact at all. It would have no impact at all. Do I think President Obama might say something like this, speaking before the Knesset, perhaps? Of course I don't. If the Israel lobby is getting weaker, it is still very powerful. America is not yet ready for a presidential approach like this. A re-elected President Obama would have more pressing priorities besides a viable state in Palestine, and priorities more easy to achieve. But I don't think anything less dramatic and less forceful has any chance of success.